The sun blazed mercilessly over Millbrook Creek, a frontier town where dreams came to die and fortunes were made on the backs of broken men. Dust swirled through the main street like ghosts of failed hopes, settling on the weathered boards of storefronts and the bent shoulders of weary workers. At precisely 3 o'clock every Tuesday, the townsfolk would pause their labors to watch the same ritual unfold. From the imposing brick building that housed Millbrook Creek Bank emerged a figure that commanded both respect and resentment: Nathaniel Whitmore, the banker who held their lives in his manicured hands. Whitmore was a man of 52 years, with silver hair slicked back with pomade and a mustache waxed to sharp points that seemed to mirror the coldness in his steel-gray eyes. His black wool suit, tailored in San Francisco, cost more than most families in Millbrook Creek earned in 6 months. Even in the oppressive heat that made lesser men wilt, Whitmore never seemed to perspire. His polished boots clicked against the wooden boards with the rhythm of a funeral march, each step a reminder of his dominance over this dusty corner of the world. The banker never acknowledged the people he passed. Not Martha Henley, who cleaned his bank floors on her hands and knees every morning before dawn. Not old Tom Sullivan, who tipped his hat respectfully despite having his farm foreclosed by Whitmore just 2 months prior. Not the children who scrambled out of his path, their bare feet silent on the hot planks as they pressed themselves against storefronts. "There goes the devil himself," whispered Sarah McKinnon to her neighbor as they watched from behind flour sacks at the general store. Her husband had lost their small ranch to Whitmore's bank after a harsh winter killed half their cattle. "Shush, Sarah," warned Mary Carson, though her own eyes held no warmth as she watched the banker pass. "He's got ears everywhere." Indeed, Whitmore seemed to hear everything and forget nothing. Every late payment, every whispered complaint, every family struggling to make ends meet, all of it was catalogued in his sharp mind like entries in a ledger book. He was a man who had turned human suffering into profit margins, and he wore his success like armor against the hatred that followed him down every street. But on this particular Tuesday, as the mercury climbed toward a blistering 105 degrees and the air shimmered with heat waves rising from the baked earth, something was different. Whitmore's usual purposeful stride seemed slightly unsteady. His face, always pale from hours spent indoors counting money, appeared even more bloodless than usual. A thin sheen of sweat, the first anyone could remember seeing on the untouchable banker, dampened his high forehead. At the far end of the street, where the respectable businesses gave way to the working district, stood a modest blacksmith shop. The rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil echoed through the afternoon heat, a sound as constant as heartbeat in this frontier town. Inside the sweltering forge, Jacob "Jake" Morrison worked bare-chested, his muscular frame gleaming with honest sweat as he shaped red-hot iron into horseshoes. Jake was everything Nathaniel Whitmore was not. Where the banker was pale and soft, Jake was bronzed and hardened by years of manual labor. Where Whitmore's hands were soft as a woman's, Jake's were calloused and scarred from countless encounters with hot metal and sharp tools. At 35, Jake had the weathered face of a man who had known hardship intimately and made peace with it. He owned nothing of value except his tools, his integrity, and a one-room shack behind the smithy that he shared with his 15-year-old daughter, Emma. His wife, Eleanor, had died giving birth to Emma, leaving Jake to raise the girl alone on a blacksmith's meager earnings. Every horseshoe he forged, every tool he repaired, every penny he earned, went toward keeping food on their table and clothes on Emma's back. "Papa, you need to rest," Emma called from the doorway, her concerned voice barely audible over the ringing hammer. She was a pretty girl with her mother's gentle eyes and her father's determined chin, wise beyond her years from a childhood spent watching her father sacrifice everything for her well-being. "Just finishing Mrs. Patterson's order, sweetheart," Jake replied, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. "These horseshoes won't shape themselves." Emma frowned, noticing how her father's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. He'd been working since before dawn, and the merciless heat was taking its toll on everyone in town. Even the dogs had sought shade hours ago, tongues lolling as they panted in whatever shadows they could find. Through the open doors of the smithy, Jake could see the familiar figure of Nathaniel Whitmore making his afternoon rounds. Like everyone else in Millbrook Creek, Jake harbored no love for the banker. Whitmore had foreclosed on 3 of Jake's friends in the past year alone, showing no mercy for families facing drought, illness, or simple bad luck. But unlike the others, who whispered their hatred in shadows and corners, Jake felt something closer to pity for the banker. What kind of man, he wondered, lived such a cold, isolated existence? What kind of life was it to be feared rather than loved, respected for your money rather than your character? "He's got everything a man could want," Jake had once told Emma during one of their evening conversations, "but I'd wager he's the poorest man in this town." As Jake returned to his work, the afternoon sun continued its relentless assault on Millbrook Creek. The dusty street baked in the heat, and somewhere in the shimmering distance, fate was preparing to bring together 2 men who had never spoken a word to each other, one who owned everything and one who owned nothing but his humanity. The heat was becoming unbearable. Even the hardiest residents of Millbrook Creek had retreated to whatever shade they could find, fanning themselves with whatever came to hand and praying for evening to bring relief. The wooden buildings seemed to sag under the oppressive weight of the sun, and the air itself felt thick enough to swim through. Nathaniel Whitmore continued his methodical walk down Main Street, but those who watched from behind curtains and doorways could see that something was wrong. The banker's usually precise steps had become slightly erratic, and he paused twice to steady himself against a hitching post. "You see that?" whispered Fred Kowalski to his wife as they observed from their mercantile store. "The high and mighty Whitmore don't look so steady on his feet." Indeed, Whitmore was struggling. The combination of the brutal heat, his heavy woolen suit, and a condition he'd been hiding from the town doctor had created a perfect storm within his body. His vision had begun to blur at the edges, and his heart was racing irregularly. Pride, however, kept him upright and moving forward. Nathaniel Whitmore had never shown weakness, and he wasn't about to start now. The townspeople watched with a mixture of concern and something darker, the satisfaction that comes from seeing an oppressor brought low by forces beyond his control. Years of accumulated resentment had created a collective coldness toward the man who had shown them no mercy in their times of need. Agnes Murphy, whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with 3 children and a debt to Whitmore's bank, watched from her boarding house window. "Serves him right," she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. Her Christian upbringing warred with the bitterness in her heart, Dr. Henry Walsh, the town's only physician, was ironically inside Whitmore's bank at that very moment, pleading for an extension on a loan he'd taken to buy medical supplies. Through the window, he could see his debtor stumbling in the street, but the banker's treatment of him had been so harsh that he found himself unable to move from his chair. Whitmore reached the center of Main Street, where the town's small fountain had run dry months ago. The wrought iron bench beside it, usually empty due to its association with the bank, seemed to call to him. But as he turned toward it, the world began to spin violently. The banker's carefully maintained composure cracked. His pale face flushed red, then drained to an alarming white. The leather portfolio he carried, filled with foreclosure notices and loan documents, slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers and scattered papers across the dusty ground. For a moment, that seemed to stretch into eternity, Nathaniel Whitmore swayed like a tree in a strong wind. His expensive hat, which had never before been removed in public, fell from his head, revealing hair damp with perspiration and a scalp that had never seen the prairie sun. Then, as if his strings had been cut by an invisible hand, the most powerful man in Millbrook Creek collapsed. He hit the dusty street with a sound that seemed to echo off every building. A small cloud of dirt rose around his fallen form, settling on his fine black suit and turning his pristine appearance into something fragile and mortal. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. The handful of people on the street stood frozen, as if witnessing something impossible. Nathaniel Whitmore, the man who had never shown a moment's vulnerability, who had crushed dreams and destroyed lives with the coldness of winter, lay motionless in the dirt like any common man. "Sweet Jesus," breathed Margaret Foster, the preacher's wife, crossing herself reflexively, but still nobody approached. Years of harsh treatment, of callous foreclosures, of cold indifference to their suffering, had created a wall of resentment that even a medical emergency couldn't immediately breach. They stood like spectators at a theater, watching a drama unfold, but feeling no compulsion to participate. Some, if they were honest with themselves, felt a dark satisfaction. Justice, they thought, had finally found Nathaniel Whitmore. The man who had shown no mercy was now at the mercy of others, and they found themselves no more inclined toward compassion than he had ever been. "Somebody should do something," said a voice from the crowd, but the speaker made no move to act on their own words. "Why should we?" came another voice, bitter with old grievances. "When did he ever help any of us?" The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Whitmore's body lay still in the growing shadow of afternoon, his face turned toward the merciless sky. His breathing was shallow and rapid, barely visible to those who bothered to look closely enough. And then, cutting through the paralysis of collective indecision, came the sound that would change everything. The clatter of tools being dropped on an anvil, followed by heavy boots running across hard-packed earth. Jake Morrison had heard the commotion from his smithy. Unlike the others, he didn't hesitate to investigate, and unlike them, when he saw a human being in distress, he didn't pause to consider their worthiness of help. His powerful legs carried him toward the fallen banker with the urgency of a man who understood that life was precious, regardless of how it had been lived. "Emma, bring water!" he shouted over his shoulder as he ran, not caring who heard him or what they might think. In Jake's world, when someone needed help, you helped them. It was that simple. As he knelt beside Nathaniel Whitmore's prone form, Jake Morrison was about to become the most important person in Millbrook Creek, not because of what he owned, but because of what he was willing to give. Jake Morrison reached Nathaniel Whitmore in less than 30 seconds, his bare chest heaving from the sudden sprint in the oppressive heat. The crowd that had gathered, still maintaining a respectful distance from both the fallen banker and the unfolding drama, watched in stunned silence as the town's poorest man dropped to his knees beside its richest. Up close, Whitmore looked far worse than he had from a distance. His usually pale complexion had turned an alarming shade of grey, and his lips had taken on a bluish tint that Jake recognized from his years of hard living. This wasn't just heat exhaustion, this was something serious. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" Jake's voice was gentle but urgent as he carefully turned Whitmore onto his side. The banker's expensive suit was now caked with dust, and his perfectly groomed hair hung limply across his forehead. There was no response. Whitmore's breathing was shallow and irregular, each breath a struggle that could be his last. Jake looked up at the circle of faces surrounding them, some curious, some hostile, all maintaining their distance as if poverty and compassion might be contagious. "Don't just stand there gawking." Jake's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to making split-second decisions in life-or-death situations. "Doc Walsh, I know you're in there." He nodded toward the bank. "This man needs help." Dr. Walsh appeared in the bank doorway, his medical bag in hand, but his feet seemingly rooted to the threshold. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was the town doctor, owing money to the very man who lay dying in the street, hesitating to provide aid. He refused to extend my loan," Walsh said weakly, as if explaining his hesitation to his own conscience. Jake's eyes flashed with something between anger and disappointment. "That's between you and your God, Doc, but right now there's a man dying." Emma Morrison appeared at her father's side, carrying a bucket of water and clean rags from the smithy. At 15, she had inherited her father's compassionate nature, and she knelt without hesitation beside the banker who had never acknowledged her existence. "Papa, his pulse is weak," she said, having learned basic medical skills from helping her father tend to injured horses and the occasional wounded cowboy who couldn't afford the doctor. Jake used one of the rags to gently clean Whitmore's face, wiping away the dust and sweat with the same care he might show a hurt child. The crowd watched this tender scene with growing discomfort, some because Jake's actions made their own inaction seem shameful, others because they were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about human nature. "Somebody needs to get him out of this sun," Jake announced, looking around for volunteers. When no one stepped forward, he began to lift the banker himself, cradling the unconscious man like a child, despite Whitmore being taller and heavier than Jake's wiry frame suggested he could handle. "Where are you planning to take him?" called out Fred Kowalski from the crowd. "Doc's office is full of folks who can't pay their bills thanks to him." Jake paused, Whitmore's dead weight in his arms. The question was valid. Where could they take a man who had made himself unwelcome everywhere in town? The hotel wouldn't accept him without payment up front, and most of the boarding houses were filled with people he'd evicted from their homes. "My place," Jake said simply. "Emma, run ahead and clear the cot." A murmur ran through the crowd. Jake Morrison's place was a one-room shack behind the smithy, a dwelling so modest that most people in town had better accommodations for their livestock. The idea of the wealthy banker being taken to such humble quarters struck many as either deeply ironic or profoundly appropriate. "You sure about this, Jake?" asked Billy Henderson, one of the few men in town who genuinely liked the blacksmith. "Man like that, he ain't gonna be grateful. Likely as not, he'll find some way to make you regret helping him." Jake shifted Whitmore's weight to get a better grip. Sweat poured down his face and chest, mixing dirt and exhaustion into a mask of determination. "Maybe he will," Jake replied, his voice steady despite his labored breathing. "But that's his choice to make, not mine. My choice is whether I'm the kind of man who leaves another human being to die in the street, and I reckon I'm not." As Jake carried his burden toward the smithy, Dr. Walsh finally overcame his paralysis and hurried to catch up, his medical bag bouncing against his leg. Whatever his feelings about Whitmore's business practices, his Hippocratic oath was finally asserting itself over his personal grievances. The crowd followed at a distance, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and shame. They had all just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Not just the collapse of Nathaniel Whitmore, but the response of Jake Morrison. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, they thought they knew what kind of man the blacksmith was. But none of them had imagined this. Agnes Murphy, watching from her boarding house window, felt tears sting her eyes as she remembered her own words from just minutes before. "Serves him right." Now, watching Jake struggle under Whitmore's weight, while her own feet remained firmly planted in place, she wondered what kind of person she had become. As the strange procession made its way toward the smithy, the afternoon sun continued to beat down mercilessly on Millbrook Creek. But in the growing shadow of Jake Morrison's humble workshop, something was beginning to change, not just in the unconscious banker being carried to safety, but in the hearts of those who watched, and in the very soul of the town itself. The poorest man in Millbrook Creek was about to give the richest man something that money couldn't buy. A second chance at life, and perhaps a first chance at understanding what it meant to be truly human. The interior of Jake Morrison's modest dwelling behind the smithy was a study in simple dignity. The single room contained only the essentials: a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a small iron stove, and a narrow cot that Emma had quickly prepared with their cleanest sheets. Sunlight filtered through a single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stifling air. Dr. Walsh worked quickly, his professional training overriding his personal feelings as he examined the unconscious banker. Jake stood nearby, having pulled on a clean work shirt out of respect for his unexpected guest, while Emma hovered with fresh water and clean rags. "Severe heat exhaustion," the doctor diagnosed, checking Whitmore's pulse and breathing. "But there's something else. His heart rhythm is irregular. Has been for a while, I'd guess." He looked up at Jake. Another few minutes in that sun, and we'd be planning a funeral instead of a recovery. The words hung heavy in the small room. Outside, they could hear the murmur of townsfolk who had gathered in the street, their voices a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "Will he be all right?" Emma asked, her young face creased with genuine concern for a man who had never shown her a moment's kindness. "Time will tell," Dr. Walsh replied, loosening Whitmore's collar and removing his expensive boots. "We need to cool him down gradually and keep him hydrated. It's going to be a long night." Jake nodded, settling into his chair beside the cot. "Then we'll be here." "Papa, you've been working since dawn," Emma protested. "You need rest too." "I'm fine, sweetheart." Besides, Jake glanced at the pale figure on the cot. "I don't think our guest should wake up alone in a strange place. Might frighten him." Dr. Walsh paused in his ministrations, struck by the simple kindness in Jake's words. Here was a man showing concern for the comfort and dignity of someone who had shown him nothing but cold indifference for years. As night fell over Millbrook Creek, Jake maintained his vigil. Emma dozed in the other chair, exhausted by the day's events, while Dr. Walsh checked on his patient every few hours before returning to his own home. The crowd outside had eventually dispersed, but Jake knew that by morning the entire town would be buzzing with questions about what had transpired. It was near midnight when Nathaniel Whitmore finally stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing confusion and disorientation as he tried to focus on his surroundings. The last thing he remembered was the scorching heat of the afternoon and a growing dizziness that seemed to pull him into darkness. "Easy there." Jake's voice was soft in the darkness, lit only by a single candle on the table. "You're safe. Had a close call today, but you're going to be fine." Whitmore turned his head toward the voice, struggling to understand where he was and why everything looked so humble. The rough wooden walls, the simple furnishings, the smell of honest work and plain living. This was unlike anywhere he had ever been. "Where?" His voice was barely a whisper, dry and cracked. "My place," Jake replied, offering a cup of water. "Behind the smithy. You collapsed in the street. Heat got to you pretty good." The banker tried to sit up, but Jake's gentle hand on his shoulder kept him prone. "Take it slow. Dr. Walsh says you need rest." Whitmore's mind began to clear, and with clarity came a flood of questions. Why was he in the blacksmith's home? Why had this man, a man whose name he didn't even know, taken him in? What had happened to the natural order of things, where money determined worth and position determined treatment? You helped me," Whitmore said, the words coming out like a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Course I did," Jake replied, as if the idea of doing anything else had never occurred to him. "You were in trouble. But I don't understand. We've never even spoken." Jake poured fresh water into a basin and wrung out a cloth. "Didn't need to speak to see you were hurting. Emma, wake up, sweetheart. Our guest is conscious." Emma stirred and immediately came alert, moving to check on Whitmore with the same gentle efficiency she brought to caring for injured animals. There was no judgment in her young eyes, no resentment for the man who represented everything her family lacked. "How are you feeling, sir?" she asked, adjusting his pillow. Whitmore stared at her, really looked at her for perhaps the first time in his life. She was young, probably 15, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work, and eyes that reflected an inner beauty that had nothing to do with fine clothes or expensive jewelry. Better. Thank you." The words felt foreign on his tongue. When was the last time Nathaniel Whitmore had thanked someone? When was the last time he had been genuinely grateful for another person's kindness? Over the next hour, as Jake and Emma tended to him with quiet efficiency, Whitmore found himself observing details he had never noticed before. The way Jake's hands, scarred and calloused from years of hot iron and heavy labor, moved with gentle precision. The way Emma hummed softly under her breath as she worked, a sound that spoke of contentment despite their obvious poverty. The way their small room, though lacking in material comforts, felt warm and alive in ways his grand house never had. "Why?" Whitmore finally asked. the question that had been building in his chest since he regained consciousness. Jake looked up from where he was refilling the water pitcher. "Why what? Why help me? You must know who I am, what I've done, the people the foreclosures." Jake set down the pitcher and met Whitmore's gaze directly. In the candlelight, his weathered face showed no anger, no judgment, only a quiet strength that came from living by principles rather than profits. "I know who you are," Jake said simply, "but that doesn't change who I am." The words hit Whitmore with more force than his collapse in the street. Here was a philosophy so foreign to his own that it might as well have been spoken in a different language. In Whitmore's world, actions had consequences, debts had to be paid, and kindness was a luxury afforded only to those who could return the favor. But in this small room, lit by a single candle and filled with the simple dignity of honest people, Nathaniel Whitmore was beginning to understand that there might be another way to live. A way where a man's worth wasn't measured by his bank account, but by the size of his heart. As dawn approached and his strength slowly returned, the banker found himself facing a question that no amount of money could answer. What kind of man did he want to be when he walked out of this room and back into the world? For the first time in decades, Nathaniel Whitmore was about to discover that the most valuable things in life couldn't be foreclosed, couldn't be owned, and couldn't be bought. They could only be given freely, as Jake Morrison had given them to him. The sun was rising over Millbrook Creek, and with it the possibility of a new beginning for both the richest and the poorest men in town. O sol da tarde pintava Millbrook Creek com os mesmos tons dourados de sempre, mas a cidade havia mudado de maneiras que nenhum visitante poderia perceber à primeira vista. As mesmas ruas empoeiradas se estendiam pela paisagem árida, os mesmos edifícios de madeira resistiam ao vento constante da planície, mas algo fundamental havia se transformado no coração dessa pequena comunidade fronteiriça. Jake Morrison continuava trabalhando em sua forja, o som rítmico de seu martelo ecoando pela tarde como sempre fez. Mas agora, ao lado da modesta oficina, erguia-se uma pequena casa de madeira pintada de branco, com uma cerca bem cuidada e um jardim onde Emma cultivava vegetais e flores. A casa não era luxuosa pelos padrões da cidade grande, mas para os Morrison representava algo que eles nunca haviam ousado sonhar: estabilidade e conforto genuínos. "Papai, o Sr. Whitmore está chegando", anunciou Emma, agora com 16 anos e florescendo na segurança de um futuro garantido. Ela havia crescido não apenas em idade, mas em confiança, sabendo que poderia frequentar a escola recém-construída sem se preocupar se haveria dinheiro para livros ou roupas adequadas. Jake limpou as mãos no avental de couro e saiu para cumprimentar o visitante que se tornara uma presença regular em suas vidas. Nathaniel Whitmore desceu de sua carruagem. Não mais a imponente berlinda preta que costumava intimidar os moradores, mas uma carroça simples e prática que ele mesmo aprendera a conduzir. O banqueiro também havia mudado visivelmente. Ainda usava ternos bem cortados, mas agora optava por tecidos mais leves e cores menos severas. Seus cabelos grisalhos estavam ligeiramente despenteados pelo vento, e ele não se incomodava mais com tais imperfeições. Mais importante ainda, seus olhos haviam perdido aquela frieza cortante, substituída por uma expressão que os moradores da cidade ainda estavam aprendendo a reconhecer: compaixão genuína. "Jake, meu amigo", Whitmore estendeu a mão com um sorriso caloroso. "Como vai o progresso da nova escola?" "Melhor do que esperávamos", respondeu Jake, apertando a mão oferecida com sincera amizade. "Os materiais que você doou são de primeira qualidade. As crianças vão ter um lugar digno para aprender." A Escola Municipal de Millbrook Creek havia sido o primeiro grande projeto conjunto entre o banqueiro transformado e o ferreiro. Whitmore forneceu os fundos e Jake organizou os trabalhadores voluntários da comunidade. Mas mais importante que o dinheiro foi o exemplo que ambos os homens deram. Que diferenças de classe não precisavam ser barreiras intransponíveis para o bem comum. "E como vai nossa Emma?" perguntou Whitmore, dirigindo-se à jovem com o carinho genuíno de um tio adotivo. "Ouvi dizer que você foi a melhor aluna da turma de matemática." Emma corou ligeiramente, mas seu sorriso irradiava orgulho. "O professor disse que tenho jeito para números. Talvez um dia eu possa ajudar papai com os negócios." "Com certeza pode", afirmou Whitmore. "E quando chegar a hora de você frequentar uma universidade, saiba que terá todo o apoio necessário." Jake observou essa interação com uma mistura de gratidão e admiração. O homem que havia desabado em sua porta um ano atrás era quase irreconhecível. A experiência de quase morrer, combinada com a bondade inexplicável que recebera de estranhos, havia operado uma transformação que nenhuma quantia de dinheiro poderia comprar. Mas as mudanças não se limitaram aos Morrison e Whitmore. Agnes Murphy, que um dia desejara ver o banqueiro sofrer, agora administrava a nova cozinha comunitária que ele havia financiado para ajudar famílias em dificuldades. Dr. Walsh, liberto de suas dívidas pessoais por um perdão inesperado, estabelecera um programa de cuidados médicos acessível para todos os moradores da cidade. "Preciso contar uma coisa", disse Whitmore, seu tom ficando mais sério. "Recebi uma proposta do Banco de Denver. Eles querem comprar nossa operação aqui em Millbrook Creek." Jake sentiu um aperto no estômago. A partida de Whitmore significaria não apenas a perda de um amigo, mas possivelmente o retorno dos velhos tempos de exploração financeira. "Vou recusar a oferta", continuou Whitmore, notando a preocupação no rosto de Jake. "Este lugar é minha casa agora. Esta comunidade me deu mais do que eu jamais dei a ela, e pretendo passar o resto da minha vida tentando equilibrar essa balança." O alívio no rosto de Jake era visível. "Nathaniel, você já fez mais por esta cidade no último ano do que nos 20 anos anteriores." Whitmore terminou com um sorriso autodepreciativo. "É um começo, mas ainda tenho muito trabalho a fazer." Enquanto os três caminhavam em direção à casa dos Morrison para o jantar semanal que se tornara tradição, as ruas de Millbrook Creek começavam a se encher com famílias voltando do trabalho. Crianças corriam entre as casas, rindo e brincando, sem a tensão constante que costumava permear a cidade. Homens e mulheres cumprimentavam uns aos outros com cordialidade genuína, unidos pelo senso renovado de comunidade que havia emergido daquele dia escaldante de um ano atrás. Sarah McKinnon, cuja fazenda havia sido salva por um refinanciamento generoso do novo Whitmore, acenou da janela de sua casa reconstruída. Tom Sullivan, que recuperara suas terras através de um programa de pagamentos flexíveis, tirou o chapéu respeitosamente, não por medo, mas por gratitude sincera. "Sabe", disse Whitmore, parando para observar a cena familiar, "eu costumava pensar que o respeito vinha do medo, que o poder significava fazer com que as pessoas se curvassem diante de você." "E agora?", perguntou Emma, sua juventude permitindo uma curiosidade direta que poucos adultos ousariam mostrar. "Agora sei que o verdadeiro respeito nasce do amor. E o amor", ele olhou para Jake, "só cresce quando você o dá livremente, sem esperar nada em troca." Jake colocou a mão no ombro de seu amigo improvável. "Você aprendeu bem, Nathaniel." "Tive um bom professor", respondeu Whitmore. "Na verdade, tive 2 bons professores." Ele olhou carinhosamente para Emma. "Vocês me ensinaram que a verdadeira riqueza não está no que você possui, mas no que você está disposto a compartilhar." Enquanto o sol se punha sobre Millbrook Creek, pintando o céu com tons de laranja e púrpura, a pequena cidade fronteiriça se preparava para mais uma noite de paz. Na casa dos Morrison, Três amigos improváveis se sentariam à mesa simples de madeira, compartilhando uma refeição humilde que valia mais do que qualquer banquete em mansão distante. E em algum lugar, no calor do coração de Jake Morrison, o ferreiro pobre, que havia mudado o destino de toda uma cidade, brilhava a satisfação silenciosa de um homem que sabia ter feito a escolha certa naquele dia escaldante. Ele havia salvado mais do que uma vida naquela tarde. Havia salvado a alma de uma comunidade inteira. O martelo na bigorna poderia ter parado de soar, mas o eco de sua lição de compaixão continuaria reverberando através das gerações de Millbrook Creek, que a verdadeira nobreza não reside nos cofres dos bancos, mas no coração dos homens dispostos a ajudar um estranho em necessidade.